Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Siversk, and in this one there are numerous advances across the Donetsk region in favor of the Russians. The Russians have managed to advance in the northern flank of Leman, the southern flank of Siversk, the southeast of Kostyantynivka, and the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region. The Russian advances south of Siversk is a localized new offensive towards the town from the south. What we're seeing is that the Russians have launched several attacks along the first and second railways to the southeast and southwest of the town. In the southwest, in the region of Vyemka, the Russians have managed to advance along the fields in between the eastern and western railway, while the Russians also managed to gain control over the town of Perishne here to the southwest of Siversk. The Russians are here moving east of the river line, advancing in the direction of Siversk along both railways and along the fields in between, gaining control over the area south of Siversk alongside the railways, the settlements, and the open fields to the south of it, will allow the Russians to establish a supply line into the town itself from the southern flank. They push by the Russian forces along the high ground from Ivanogorivka towards Siversk to gain control of the fortified positions overlooking the southern flank, and they push from Novoselivka towards Siversk from the south, will allow the Russians to gain control over the fortified positions overlooking the high ground towards the south, gain control over those, and pushing from the southern direction will allow the Russians to have secure supply line into the town, which would then allow them to start storming the town from the south, or a pincer towards the fortified positions attacking from the northern and southern flanks, and cutting off the supplies leading into the town in the southwest of it. Taking a look at the Ukrainian supply lines leading into Siversk, we see that the Ukrainians have the road that goes from Slovyansk through the smaller road towards Sviatopokrovsk and then into Siversk. Then there's the secondary roads that lead through the northwest of Siversk into the settlement. Both of these go through Kalinivka here to the west of Siversk. The Russians pushing from the south will allow them to push towards Sviatopokrovsk, which will cut off the main supply route for the Ukrainians in the Siversk section. As for the road further north, the Russians can push down along the Siversk-Donetsk river line, or through the river line from the south through Serebryanka, or a push directly through the fortifications towards the northern flank of Siversk, or a push continuing from the south. The Russians have a lot of options. They could also simply do an operational encirclement with the secondary road, which is a wider road and with a smaller capacity. Having fire control over it would limit the supplies significantly, while also inflicting casualties on the Ukrainians. If the Ukrainians decide to supply through the highway connecting Leman to Siversk, the Russians can blow the bridge, or they can allow it to happen and then just attack a wider section of the supply lines, while at the same time the Ukrainians would be splitting their supplies between Leman and Siversk. It is difficult to speak of the Siversk section of the front line without speaking of the Leman section despite the river line in between them, as the Ukrainian positions supplying the forces in those two locations either go through Izium to the northwest or Slovyansk to the southwest. These are the main supply hubs for the Ukrainian forces operating in this section of the front line. The Russians are working on cutting off the Izium supply line through the northwestern flank of Leman, while the Slovyansk supply line is fairly safe. However, it will be overstretched if they have to single-handedly supply both the Leman section, the Siversk section, the northern flank of Bakhmut, and down towards Kostyantynivka, as all of the supplies now go to Slovyansk now that Pokrovsk has been cut off to the southwest, and with the Izium being cut off in the northwest, the Ukrainians would put all supplies through Slovyansk to supply the Slovyansk-Kostyantynivka line, the northern and eastern section of the front line. This also means that the Slovyansk-Kostyantynivka line is the primary target of Russian long-range strikes, whether it's MLRS, FAB bombs, artillery, and whatnot. Slovyansk-Kostyantynivka line is the target, as it will inflict a lot of casualties simply because the Ukrainians are forced to pour all of their supplies and their reinforcements and reservists into these areas. The Russian advances here to the south of Siversk include a push towards Fedorivka, combined with their forces attacking from the southern and northern flank, crossing the Bakhmutovka River and gaining control over the eastern parts of the settlement. The Russians are looking to gain full control over the settlement and the highway connecting to it. On the eastern flank of Veshchakivka, the Ukrainians still have several fortified positions located on the high ground overlooking the settlement. The Russians at the same time push to gain control of Pereishne and gain control over these fields to the south of Siversk, both of which are a push towards Siversk itself. The Russians managed to enter Viemka several times, but were unable to gain and hold control of it because the settlement simply doesn't exist any longer because of all of the fighting, completely destroying the buildings. As for Pereishne, the buildings still exist here, mostly basements, as the majority of the ones simply standing are very destroyed and damaged. The Russians will be mainly advancing through the railways themselves, as the cover of the forests will allow them to advance further northwards, mainly with infantry. To the northeast of Leman, the Russians have managed to gain control over the fortified position here at the intersection, supplying Zarishne from the north and connecting it with Stavki. At the same time, the Russians continue their operations to attack the flank of Mirne, as they are looking to cut off the supplies and encircle the Ukrainian forces within the settlement, then push towards Zarishne from the road to the northwest and to the northeast connected with Mirne, gaining control over the northern flank, will allow the Russians to secure their bridgeheads across in the direction of Zarishne and slowly push the Ukrainians out of the settlement. Gaining control over this will allow the Russians to start offensive operations in the direction of Leman from the northern and eastern directions. Moving up in the direction of Kostyantynivka, the Russians have managed to gain full control over the town of Oleksandro Shultyne. The Russians are here continuing offensive operations in the direction of Kostyantynivka from the northeastern and southeastern directions, while fighting continues in the direction of Leman and Pleshivka. The Russians were here geolocated on the western outskirts of Oleksandro Shultyne. Between Oleksandro Shultyne and Kostyantynivka, there is a dacha area, open field, some fortified positions. It's unlikely the Russians will advance further westwards, but instead in northern direction to connect with their forces in Predishine, secure the remaining forest patches and the fortified positions in between Vilahora, Oleksandro Shultyne and Predishine, which will strengthen the Russian offensive capabilities in the direction of Kostyantynivka from the northeastern direction, and then combine their forces in the south towards Pleshivka along the railway towards Kostyantynivka. The main push by the Russians towards Kostyantynivka is going to be coming from the northeastern and southeastern directions, as the Russians will be advancing along the urban area here to the south of Kostyantynivka and the dacha area to the northeast of Kostyantynivka through the high ground. The Russians need to secure the supply lines and the defensive lines outside of Kostyantynivka before they can start fighting over the city itself. In the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region, the Russians continue offensive operations into the Dnipropetrovsk region to the south of Sechneve, where the Russians managed to gain control over the forest lines south of the settlement. Russians continue offensive operations to gain control over the settlements here to the southeast of the Vovcha river line, advancing alongside the river line itself to gain control over the entire eastern and southern bank of it. The Russians are here working on gaining control over the first and second lines of defense. To establish control over those, they need to isolate the Ukrainian reinforcements from the defensive lines themselves. Establishing their own defensive line along the Vovcha river line will allow them to isolate the second line of defense from the Ukrainian reinforcements coming from the northern direction, facing off against them in one direction, which is the western direction, will limit the Ukrainian counterattack capabilities. Therefore, the Russians are working on gaining control over the river line to secure the northern flank as they continue advancing along their first and second defensive lines. With regards to the Russian offensive operations within the Donetsk region, the Institute for the Study of War stated that the Russians are relocating and rotating their forces from the Zaporizhia, Kherson, and Sumy regions to the Donetsk and Pokrovsk direction specifically, as they are working on an offensive in the fall season that will work on the direction of Pokrovsk to gain control over the city itself, and then onwards towards Dobropilya and the rear of Kramatorsk and Slovyansk. Exactly as I have been analyzing and looking at for the past half a year to a year, where the Russians clearly are working on gaining control over Pokrovsk to establish it as a logistical hub for offensive operations to the rear of Zaporizhia, but also to flank the Kostyantynivka line. To the east of the Kostyantynivka line, the Ukrainians have several lines of defense. They have control over the high ground. They are overlooking several positions of the Russians, limiting their supply capabilities. While the western flank is limited to one or two defensive lines, while the supply lines are also exposed. There is one main supply line that goes into Slovyansk through Izium and through Barvinkove. These are the two main supply lines, the railway through Barvinkove and the highway through Izium. Then there are several additional roads that lead into the rear in the direction of Kramatorsk and Slovyansk, but these are smaller roads. If Russians are able to gain control over Pokrovsk, Dobropilya, and advance along the western outskirts of the Donetsk region, then they're able to cut off some of these supply lines leading into the Slovyansk-Kostyantynivka line from the west, forcing the Ukrainians to resupply simply from the Barvinkove and Izium directions with no alternatives. This means that the Russians, if they're able to keep the Kostyantynivka direction open, and force the Ukrainians to resupply through the eastern section of the front line and gain control over the eastern and western flanks of the Slovyansk-Kostyantynivka line, while keeping Kostyantynivka, Grushkivka, Kramatorsk under Ukrainian control, they'll be able to significantly strain the Ukrainian supply lines and force them to dedicate a lot of forces and supplies through a single road to resupply their forces, while at the same time having fire control over all of the cities along the defensive line itself. This works perfectly in line with their objective to destroy the Ukrainian army. As for gaining control of the Donetsk region itself, the Russians would be slowly advancing through the south of Kostyantynivka, forcing the Ukrainians to send their forces to the deepest part of the pocket and fight them in that city, as they are in control of the high ground to the northeast and flanking them from the southwest. In conclusion, in the coming months, the Russians will be working to gain control over Siversk and Leman on the northern and eastern flanks of the Slovyansk-Kostyantynivka line, then fight through the canal and the fortified lines to the east of the defensive line to gain control over the high ground overlooking them, while at the same time their main push will be on the western parts of the Donetsk region to gain control over the supply lines overlooking the Slovyansk-Kostyantynivka line from the west and supplying them, and limiting the supply lines to a single one through the Izium highway to the north of Slovyansk, gaining operational encirclement over the defensive line and sieging it from the south. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.